Today we got a story from a subscriber who said this kid he knows claimed that the SCP Foundation was real and that his dad actually worked for it. Leave a like in the video to claim your free nothing, subscribe to the channel, and let's get right into it. So we're going to call the subscriber who sent in the story, we're going to call him Brian. And by the way, if you want to send in stories, send them in either to my Instagram or my Discord server. Both are linked in the description. Anyways, right, so this story happened one day when Brian was at lunch and he was sitting down with some of his friends. And then this guy that he didn't really know that well. And, he talked to him once or twice, but he just wasn't really friends with this guy. And we're going to call this guy Steve for the sake of giving him a name, right? So Brian was sitting there with his friends when Steve came up and sat down, and they looked over and they were like, hey, what's up? How's it going? And Steve was like, pretty good. And then Steve just started eating. And, it was kind of like a weird encounter, but they didn't really care. So, right, Brian and his friends go on. They're talking about whatever. Everyone there is enjoying, food or their lunch or whatever. And then Steve says, hey, you guys want to hear something that just is really weird and I just can't get over? And Brian's like, yeah, sure. And Steve says, I don't know how to put this, but my dad works for this organization, this secret government organization. And Brian, who doesn't know this kid that well, is, intrigued, and, his friends are probably intrigued too. So Brian's like, oh, all right, yeah, tell me about that. That sounds interesting. And Steve kind of looks around, kind of looks over his shoulder and is like, you can't tell anyone about this. And the thing is, right, Brian, he's a little suspicious because he's like, all right, why is he telling me? What's the point in telling me? Why would he even say this if this was true? But he's like, you know what? Anyways, I'm just interested to hear what Steve has to say. So Brian's like, all right, man, I think we're good. I don't think anyone's listening. What's up? And Steve is like, all right, I found this out one day when, my dad, who claims to be a lawyer, right, he came back from work one day and my mom seemed really worried and I was a little concerned. Because I heard them talking and I heard them yelling and being all upset or whatever. So I snuck out of my room. I walked down the stairs, and I walked down the stairs just enough so that I could hear what they were talking about, but not enough so that I couldn't hear so that they couldn't see me. So I was hidden, but I could hear what they were saying. And Brian was like, all right, okay. Steve goes on to say that he was hearing from his mom saying I don't want you to go on with this project. The government has no right to make you do this. We don't want to put your life in danger. So after those words, I realized it's something that, my dad probably didn't work for the government, or that my dad wasn't a lawyer because he said that he was, was in private practice and that he never worked for the government. So hearing now that the government was putting him in danger with his next job really did confuse me. But then my dad went on to say, that, he had to do it as it was his patriotic duty for his country. And Brian at this point was even if what he was being told wasn't true, he was like, all right, well, tell me about this. And Steve goes on to say, all right, well, after I heard that, I kind of ran back up to my room because I heard my parents start to walk up the stairs and I didn't want them to know that I knew anything. So I pretended like I was in bed, and my mom came into the room to check to see if I was actually asleep or not, and I did a pretty good job pretending that I was asleep, because it looked like she came in, looked at me for a good 30 seconds, and then quietly closed the door. After that, I got out of bed, and I leaned up to the door as closely as I could so that I could try and hear, or at least try and make out what I was hearing outside. I heard, my mom and my dad in their room, and they were talking. I couldn't make out everything, but I heard snippets of a conversation. This was the important thing that I heard. And before Steve said what he thought was important, he looked up at Brian and the other people there, and he's like, honestly, it's really stupid of me to tell you guys, I just don't really have any friends here, and we had a few good interactions. I just needed to tell someone about this. I can't keep going with this this knowledge kept to myself. He said, you got to promise me that you don't tell anyone. And, Brian, who's interested in the story, is like, don't worry, dude, we got you, if this does, even if, this isn't, true or whatever, we just won't tell anyone, it's fine. He's like, Steve's like, dude, it is true, but I get why you don't believe me. And he goes on to say that the most important thing that he heard was his mom saying that, that, my dad should retire from the SCP Foundation, and that, the government said that he could retire at any time and he'd be given, a great compensation package, and then he can't really say anything about it. That's part of the deal. Apparently, you get really smart scientists, really smart people on cases, you pay them handsomely, and then they don't talk about it. And she said, the SCP Foundation, the U.S. government said that they would, you can leave at any time, and as long as you sign, a billion NDAs, you'll be paid totally fine. You can go on and do whatever you wanted. Didn't you want to, go sailing, right? Isn't that your passion? I'm sure you'll have enough money to do that. And then Steve says, and I'll never forget what my dad responded. And he said, my dad responded to her, yes, that does sound nice, but I would never be able to live with myself if I didn't see this case to the end. After this point, right, Steve didn't really hear anything else besides, the talking was a bit more mumbled. He didn't really hear anything else clear, and then eventually the conversation ended, so Steve went back to his bed. He only was able to sleep for, 2 or 3 hours that night because he was just trying to process what he was hearing. That, one, his dad was not actually a lawyer, and in fact, he worked for the government. 2, he worked for, a secret part of the government, that was apparently called the SCP Foundation, and 3, that he was working on a project that was apparently super dangerous and that he felt like he had to see it out or he wouldn't be able to morally live with himself. That's a lot to put on someone. And as Steve is saying this, Brian looks at him with this look and he's like, I think I've heard of the SCP Foundation before. Isn't that some kind of internet thing? And Steve goes on all right, I'll explain that in a second. Let me finish. And Brian's all right, man. Okay. No objections. I just want to let you know I heard that before. If this is some kind of elaborate prank. And Steve's no, I'll explain that in a second. Just give me a second. And Brian's all right, man. So Steve goes on to say that, for a couple days he was just thinking about it, and that he went online and he looked up SCP Foundation and he found a wiki about it. He saw a bunch of YouTube videos about it. So at this point, right, Steve was really, really confused because he was this is an online thing. What? And he's looking into it, and everywhere it said that this is fake, this is an internet thing. But he was just really, really confused by all this. So a couple days later, both his mom and his dad were out. He was about 16 at the time, or he is 16 by the time, he is 16 since this happened very recently, right? He is 16, so he says that, he was able to stay home when both of his parents left. Steve then goes on to tell Brian that, he waited for the day when both of his parents were gone, and then he went into his parents' room. And he was just going through everything. He was shuffling through stuff, and it took him a long time, and he couldn't find anything. And then he got to his dad's drawer. He opened it up. There was a watch. There was a wallet. There was a passport. There was a couple, crumpled up dollar bills. There was, a tie clip or something. There was some scratch paper. There's some business cards. Nothing that seemed out of place. But then Steve was all right, if I'm going to hide something here, where would I hide something in every single movie, in every single TV show, or what is the place to look for? So first of all, Steve looked under the bed, nothing there. Steve was tapping on the walls, right, to hear if there's a fake wall or something. Steve even went to a little bookshelf they had and pulled out every book, in Scooby-Doo when you pull out a book and the thing opens up or something crazy. Steve then goes on to say that at this point, he was basically done, looking through, until he remembered, in one of the TV shows or whatever, about a false bottom when it came to drawers. So he returned to his dad's drawer and kind of looked around it, looked under it, and that's when he saw, a little hole, a little thing. And he saw next to, in his dad's drawer, a piece of chalk that really just kind of seemed out of place at that point. And he took out the piece of chalk, and the circumference of the chalk was the perfect diameter for this hole. So sure enough, he placed the piece of chalk under the desk, pushed it up, and it was enough to reveal that there was a fake top. At this point, right, Steve realized that he was in really deep. And at this point, he was all right, I got to make sure that I don't, I got to leave everything the way I found it. So he undid the fake top, put everything up. He was, constantly checking to see, or he was telling Brian that he was constantly checking to hear if, he heard his dad coming back or anything that would have alerted. And he was looking for, fake, wires or pieces of tape or something that would, if you break them and you don't notice, the person will notice. If there's a piece of tape and you break it, and you can't replace it, right? So when someone comes back and they see the tape is broken, it means someone was tampering. He didn't see anything like that, and that's when he went through the files. And it looks like through the files, right, he had there was a case file, And this case file was on something called SCP-096. And he was reading the introduction, and the introduction says SCP-096 is some kind of creature that, in summary, when someone sees its face, they will pass away, right? And it will go and attack them. And it also said the SCP-096 existence has leaked to the internet. However, through a serious disinformation campaign, they've pumped out actually an enormous amount of content on SCP-096 to make it seem as if it is just something on the internet. The document said that originally leaks of SCP-096 existence were leaked to the internet. However, they followed it up with hundreds of thousands of pieces of content, of fan art of it, of stories of it, of animations of it, to almost create an artificial creepypasta, an artificial wave of traction. It's almost as if there was a report of a zombie, and then all the zombie movies came out. You just wouldn't believe it because of all the other kind of fake stuff surrounding it. So it's almost like a massive disinformation campaign. And the summary ended with we have not obtained SCP-096. We do not know where he is, and he is a top level threat of danger. At this point, right, Steve is reading through this when he hears a car pull back into the driveway. At this point, he starts to panic. He starts to freak out, but he also knows he's telling Brian that he needs to put this back just perfectly. So he goes in, he puts the files down as he saw it. He puts the thing down. He puts the keys, the desk, everything back in the order he saw it, as well as a piece of chalk. And then he also dusted off the hole where he placed the chalk up to remove the fake bottom, just so it didn't look like someone was just there. He leaves the room. He makes sure everything looks the same. He leaves the room as the door was opening downstairs. And it was Steve's dad saying, "Hey, Steve, how's it going? Just back from lunch, with my friend. Hope all is well." And Steve's like, yeah, things are good. And so so Steve is all right, and that's happened as of yesterday. And he's telling Brian. At this point, right, Brian is looking at him. He's like, all right, there's a lot of detail here. And he did answer my questions. However, this is still ridiculous. No way this is true. And the thing is, right, this happened only a couple days ago. Well, that's what Brian said. Brian sent me the story over on Instagram. And the thing is, right, Brian doesn't believe Steve. He thinks that Steve is just trying to get some attention, and also why would he tell Brian or whatever. But Brian just sent me this story to tell on the channel. He doesn't actually believe Steve, but he thought it was pretty entertaining, and I read it and I thought it was really entertaining, and I thought you guys would enjoy. Subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a like in the video, then click one of the 4 videos on screen or any other video to support the channel. Peace.